In the history of conspiracy and intrigue, few entities loom as nefariously as the KGB. Immortalized in literature, film, popular culture, and many books, they've become the quintessential baddies of the era, always cloaked in a veil of mystery and danger. Because of this, when we imagine the KGB, we're likely to imagine either shadowy figures orchestrating plots from deep in the bowels of Moscow, or undercover communist hardliners advancing communism via means of the bomb and the bullet. Certainly this image is not entirely unfounded, as many of their operations did have this kind of energy about them, but it is lacking a certain weirdness that typified many of the KGB's operations, and it is exactly the weird operations that we're interested in today, so let's jump in, shall we? The KGB had many secret weapons in its arsenal, but its most potent was its most simple. Rumpy-pumpy. It was a genius, yet simple tactic. Have tidy men and women seduce foreigners of interest, at which point they could either be manipulated or blackmailed into doing the agency's bidding. The tactic was a long-lived one, with one of its earliest architects being Yakov Agranov of the NKVD, the KGB's Leninist-era forerunner. Agranov saw potential in using the allure of Soviet Bolshoi ballerinas, cinema, and theater actresses to ensnare the creative class intelligentsia. His vision led to the establishment of the Lenin Technical School in 1931, a specialist academy dedicated solely to the purposes of teaching attractive men and women the art of seduction and manipulation. The school appears to have been a success, with famous spies such as Richard Sorge, who plied his trade in East Asia in the interwar years, and Nikolai Kuznetsov, who similarly plied his trade in Europe during World War II, both being alumni of the school. With the tactic proving successful, more and more resources were dedicated to it as time went on, and soon more schools began popping up, with a notable one being the vaguely named State School No. 4. According to former CIA officer Jason Matthews, the institution was dedicated to grooming female swallow and male raven agents to perfection. Matthews even goes so far as to claim that the practice still exists today, with expensive bars in Moscow still supposedly being stuffed with swallows to this day. We don't know much about these schools, but Yuri Krotkov, a journalist and screenwriter who defected to the West in 1963, gave some insight. He worked for the KGB as a headhunter, using his connections within the media to identify attractive women suitable for seduction assignments and entice them into the role with monetary rewards and lavish clothing. Upon saying yes, they would be whisked off to State School No. 4 for training prior to deployment. And now, to see just how effective the school was, let's have a look at what its alumni got up to, starting with Czechoslovakian husband and wife duo Karl and Hanna Kosher, who infiltrated the very heart of the CIA. Turns out, they did rather well. So pervasive was their infiltration that at a single swingers club in Washington, D.C., they pulled 10 CIA operatives and 1 senator into their web of intrigue. A specific mark of note is Clayton J. Lonetree, an American Marine stationed at the American Embassy in Moscow, who, after being ensnared by a swallow, granted Russian agents unauthorized access to the embassy premises on multiple occasions. Ultimately, so pervasive were these tactics that people of interest at every level of foreign government were compromised by them, including Sukarno, the president of Indonesia, Maurice de Jean, French ambassador during the 1950s, and Colonel Louis Guibault, a French military attaché. As you can imagine, if exposed, the consequences for these outed conspirators could be dire. If you were lucky, you would just become a point of mockery for several years and gain an embarrassing footnote on your Wikipedia page. But if you were unlucky, your outing could mean the end of your life itself, as was the case with Colonel Guibault, who simply couldn't handle the collapse of his career and doubts over his loyalty and tragically took his own life to escape it all. By the time the Cold War era approached its twilight, tales of encounters with KGB swallows and ravens were just a part of daily life for foreigners in the Soviet Union, with their presence in their hangouts even becoming a point of jokes and mockery. But even still, no one can doubt that the tactic was every bit as effective as it was weird. Now, if having hunky men and bewitching women telling you that they find nuclear launch clothes super sexy and would love to know more wasn't brazen enough for you, our next weird operation may just scratch that itch, as it features the KGB Trojan horsing recording equipment right into the heart of the US government. The scheme was initiated in the early days of the Cold War, 1945 to be exact. This was a time when the future state of US-Soviet relations was still very much up for debate. There was some clear animosity enmity and rivalry there, but there were also shreds of wartime cordiality and camaraderie. The two superpowers were offering up a greeting with one hand, but there was a knife behind their back in the other. In this environment, it came as a most welcome surprise to the US ambassador in Moscow when the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization appeared at his embassy with a beautifully crafted replica of the US Great Seal as a present. Supposedly, the gift was an olive branch, a gesture to demonstrate that for all their differences, the two superpowers had once been and could continue to be friends. The ambassador promptly accepted the gesture and ordered that it be displayed proudly in his own personal office. One small problem though, that spiel about the seal being a gesture of friendship and cooperation, well, it was complete nonsense. In reality, it was a gift that demonstrated the increasing hostility and suspicion that existed between the two superpowers, because buried secretly within the seal was recording equipment which now sat right in the very heart of US operations in Moscow. It would sit there for a long time because not only was the bug very well hidden, but it was also a passive bug, meaning that it didn't require a direct power source and could be activated whenever needed by a radio signal sent from outside the embassy. It would be there for as long as American short-sightedness allowed it to be. But just how long was that? Surely the Americans uncovered it in good time. Right? The no doubt stringent security sweeping measures are one of America's hottest embassies, no doubt discovering it the next time they swept through the ambassador's office. Right? Well, actually, no, it wasn't discovered for nearly 7 years, not being discovered until 1952. And to be fair to the Americans, as much as it is easy and indeed funny to point at them and go, that's pretty dumb, there may be more to the story, as two versions of the bug's discovery exist. The first story, the face-saving one, claims that the bug was so top of the line that they could never have been expected to find it with the technology of the day. The other story, the they stupid one, claims that the Americans had simply never entertained the idea that the seal could be bugged. And which one is true? Well, we don't know. Neither version has been confirmed, so just pick whichever one sounds more likely to you. In the history of the KGB, few operations managed to leave a mark as indelible as Operation Infection. Crafted meticulously by the KGB and equal parts weird to evil, this operation wasn't about assassinating key targets, but about corrupting the global narrative. Their weapon of choice? Misinformation. The aim of Operation Infection was simple: to sow seeds of doubt about the origin of the AIDS epidemic that started to ravage the globe in the 1980s. More specifically, the KGB planned to suggest that the deadly virus had been the creation of the US military, developed as a biological weapon at the US Army's Biological Warfare Lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Fortunately, the KGB had a tried and tested strategy for such operations: publish the story in an otherwise credible foreign newspaper to light the touch paper, then just wait as the chattering classes bellowed the fledgling flames into a raging inferno of hysteria. For Operation Infection, they chose an Indian newspaper called The Patriot, a largely respected newspaper known for not being adverse to running more out there story about AIDS was sent to print in 1983. But before we get into the operation's results, it's essential that we understand the KGB's strategy here. They didn't intend for the story to immediately explode and be on the front corner of every newspaper the next day. No, they expected the hysteria to build slowly, to spread to the odd other newspaper here and there before they then exploded the story themselves. This would give the story some degree of credibility because then when it exploded, well, lots of people have written about this story, so there must be something to it. This gave the KGB a level of control over the spread of the story that they simply would not have had if they relied entirely on blind hysteria. The escalation of the story came 2 years later in 1985 when the KGB, now confident that the story seemed credible enough, sent the story to a Soviet scientific journal, in turn making it seem even more credible because, oh well, it is in a journal after all. From here, the KGB's job was done, with the rest of the story's spread being handled by a torrent of Western journalists, all eager to be the first on the big scoop. Many publications started appearing worldwide, each referencing the last as a source, creating an echo chamber of misinformation. Ultimately, it is hard to ever be truly sure of the full extent of this operation's success, but we can get some clues here and there. One such clue is that it wasn't just the public that was taken in by the ruse, as even high-ranking officials and organizations started giving credence to the possibility of the US's involvement in the creation of AIDS. Another such clue is that the KGB conspiracy still hasn't died off. All of you watching this video have likely encountered this conspiracy at one point or another, and now, well, you know where it all started. The US government and other global entities did, of course, try to combat the narrative. Investigations were launched and evidence was presented to debunk the claims. But as with any disinformation campaign, the truth struggled to catch up to the lie, and sadly, it appears as though this lie is going to be with us long into the future. The bustling streets of London are, thanks to James Bond, probably the first place that spring to mind when you think of Cold War espionage. And on the 7th of September 1978, those very streets that Mr. Bond made famous would bear witness to an assassination so audacious and sophisticated that it could have been ripped straight from one of his movies. The target was Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident who had defected to the West. The weapon of choice? A humble umbrella modified to be able to deal death promptly and discreetly. Georgy Markov had been a prominent novelist and playwright in Bulgaria, once enjoying the favor of the country's communist government. However, as his criticisms of the regime grew, so did his list of enemies. After defecting in 1969, he settled in London and began to work for the BBC World Service, Radio Free Europe, and Deutsche Welle. His broadcasts, which criticized the Bulgarian communist government, made him a thorn in the side of his old regime. This set the stage for that fateful day. Markov was waiting for a bus near Waterloo Bridge when he felt a sharp sting on the back of his leg. Turning around, he saw a man picking up an umbrella who then hurriedly crossed the street and hailed a cab. Markov, slightly bemused, continued with his day, but by that evening he had developed a high fever and was rushed to the hospital. 4 days later, in intense pain and with a baffled medical team around him, he was pronounced dead. The mysterious circumstances of Barkov's sudden illness raised eyebrows. It was only after a meticulous post-mortem examination that the true cause was discovered. A tiny pellet, no larger than a pinhead, was embedded in Markov's leg. The pellet, made of a specialized alloy, had 2 small holes drilled into it, and it was filled with a minuscule amount of one of the world's most deadly toxins, ricin. The modus operandi was chilling in its sophistication. The umbrella had merely been a delivery device, firing the pellet with enough force to penetrate the skin but not leave an obvious wound. Once inside the body, the ricin was released, causing a fatal breakdown of the victim's vital systems. It was a method of assassination that was not only highly effective, but also incredibly discreet. The immediate suspicion fell on the Bulgarian Secret Service. Barkov had been a prominent dissident, and his anti-regime broadcasts were undoubtedly a source of embarrassment for the government. Yet the sheer intricacy and expertise required to engineer such a killing pointed fingers at a much larger and more experienced player in the espionage game, the KGB. As investigations progressed, it was believed that the KGB, with its extensive experience and resources, provided the know-how and possibly even the device. The choice of weapon and the manner of execution bore the hallmarks of the KGB's modus operandi: death delivered with clinical precision and minimal fuss. So let's close today's video with Operation Pandora. This dark ploy, orchestrated by the KGB, was not designed to steal secrets or acquire assets, but rather to exploit America's own internal fissures. Its primary aim? To instigate a race war, thereby tearing apart the very fabric of American society. The brainchild of the KGB during the late 1960s, Operation Pandora saw the Cold War not as a battle of nuclear arsenals, but as a war of influences. Soviet intelligence believed that America's racial melting pot was also its Achilles heel. By intensifying racial tensions and fanning the flames of discord, the KGB saw an opportunity to weaken its superpower rival without firing a single shot. The operation was brought to light by Vasily Mitrokhin, a former KGB archivist who defected to the United Kingdom in 1992. Mitrokhin's trove contained an array of documents that detailed numerous KGB operations, but Operation Pandora stood out for its sheer audacity and wicked nature. The mechanics of the operation were as intricate as they were insidious. The KGB devised a scheme to manipulate and exploit various racial and ethnic groups in America. These included the Ku Klux Klan, black militant groups like the Black Panthers, and the Jewish Defense League. By pulling the strings from the shadows, the KGB aimed to incite violence and chaos, leading to a widespread civil unrest and potential civil war. Their tools were varied: propaganda materials to deepen racial divides, infiltration of key organizations to gather intelligence and cause internal strife, and even planning acts of violence to be blamed on other groups. One of the most disturbing aspects of this operation was the plan to bomb a historically black college in New York and blame it on the Jewish Defense League. On the 20th of July 1971, the KGB's first overseas department, led by Anatoly Tikhonovich Kiryev, set this plan into motion. Once the explosive was detonated, anonymous phone calls were made to black organizations, pinning the responsibility on the Jewish Defense League. However, the Soviet plot did not unfold as planned. United States counterintelligence, always vigilant, caught wind of these sinister designs, and by the early 1980s, the KGB spy ring leading the operation in New York was fully dismantled, putting an end to Operation Pandora.